Hello, hello. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. So, this one is a bit of a special request from a couple friends of mine, Indigo and Toya. Uh, in a stream of a couple days ago, a question came up about Black Greek letter organizations. Essentially, why use those letters and why not something more connected to African culture? And for me, and a lot of other Greeks who have pledged, what I'm about to say you've probably heard before, but they are. Uh, it's a little bit of an answer, but I do want to kind of speak on more broadly um, how those organizations came about, and as well as like what their purpose or their aims and goals was, and kind of a little bit of that because I feel like it's easy to look back with our modern eyes and see certain things or postulate certain things, but we lose context of the period of time. So, to kind of start it out, for those who don't know, I'm a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, the oldest and the coldest, the all father of the NPHC. We spawned everybody else. For those who don't know, we are the first fraternity created for collegiate black men. And the reason I say it that way is because, once again, we are the first of the NPHC. And it turns out there was actually a small group that did predate us by just a smidge. Uh, they are known as the Boule, Sigma Pi Phi. The reason that some folks probably know, excuse me, the reason that less folks probably know about them is because they were incepted as a professional fraternity. Uh, so Alpha, Omega Psi Phi, Kappa Alpha Psi, Iota Phi Theta, I ain't forget y'all this time, Phi Beta Sigma, and the ladies, of course, aka DST, Sigma Gamma Rho, and Zeta Phi Beta. Uh, all these organizations started in colleges. So that is the important distinction to be made there. All these groups essentially go back to that collegiate institution structure. But to kind of set the stage for a moment, I want us to try to imagine what it would be like living in the early 1900s, literally 125 years ago, and consider being in a society in which, if you're a young black man, like a lot of the founders of A5A were, well, technically, most of them weren't that young. Most of them were in their like their mid 20s. A couple of them, like Chapman, I want to say was well into his 30s. Um, they, you're talking about people who are probably the children of slaves. As a collective, you're talking about folks who are more than likely the children of freedmen whose family probably were slaves. This is around the time that my own great grandmother was born, and her parents were also slaves. She was the youngest. They were children when they were in servitude, but so keep in mind this context that you are in a 40 years removed from that, about 20 some removed from Reconstruction, and the ease at which we find information today. If you had a library with a Dewey Decimal System, like, that was the equivalent of high speed 5G back in those days. And you also have to keep in mind, what was the social environment and climate like? What was the prevailing thoughts of the day? And the prevailing thought was very steeped in racist pseudoscience, ethnography, if you will, which were measuring craniums to infer intellectual capacity. I've seen where it was like the measure from the forearm to the wrist, and was correlated with your aptitude to be a substitute for beast of burden. You had all these different things going on, basically to say if you weren't white, you weren't shit, for lack of a better term. And in particular for Africa, this is where it gets a little interesting. At that time, the consensus thought was it was a dark continent. All the people who lived there were savages. There wasn't much to it, and essentially that, all these people were one step removed from apes and savages. There was no acknowledgement of any of the great civilizations or empires that we know of today, such as Mali, Song, the Ashanti, so on and so forth, from coming out of West Africa. You may have gotten some begrudging acknowledgement of Axum or the Ethiopians, just because of kind of how their whole situation went with colonization, with their resistance. But even then, like, they highly downplayed. And I know you're probably thinking like, oh, dude, Egypt. Yeah, Egypt was thought to be a white civilization at that time. It was said that, basically, of course, these N-words can't build these pyramids. The Sphinx. Of course, it was white folks. So that's the climate that you're dealing with. And keep in mind, there aren't a whole lot of, if you have access to the library, there aren't a whole lot of books that are telling the truth about you at this time. And, it is a environment that is rife with segregation. And, it's to essentially being in that A5A was born in the North. It wasn't quite the same type of segregation as in the down South. A lot of these guys actually worked. A few of them actually worked in frat houses of some of these white guys. And what ended up happening was, excuse me, somebody probably would have got fired for this if they realized it. But they eventually did find some books that illuminated and shed some truth on the black man and his influence in the world. In particular, as it relates to those letters. And I'll make this small detour. In a sense, those letters are our letters. And I don't mean the A5A. I'm referring to the alphabet itself, because what they eventually did find was some information from a guy named Herodotus, which kind of shoots all that racial superiority shit all in the foot about all these peoples being uncivilized, this, that, the third. Because he kind of says like, yo, we got a lot from the Egyptians. Damn near everything from the Egyptians, and they you know our knowledge of medicine, cosmology, architecture, we got that from the Egyptians. Matter of fact, even our gods are reskins. Save for a couple, even our gods are reskins of Egyptian gods. And he also made mention of a few other things, but in particular, when it comes down to the writing system, and here's where I meant it. It's a little bit of a roundabout, but this is what they found. Egyptians had several different writing systems, I guess you could say. So we have the hieroglyphs, which I think everybody knows or has seen, but what you may not have known or seen is there's a script called hieratic, and that hieratic script was used for like your everyday stuff. Like that's the stuff that you would write on papyrus to, say, for instance, keep account of things. Like, hey, we used this many blocks today in the pyramid. How much do we have still left in the quarry already cut? You know, transcribing it and writing simple messages. Hey, look, we need you to go to blah 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 and do X Y Z. You would not carve a tablet and send that to somebody. It was far easier to get some papyrus and write using this simplified script. Now, the hieratic influenced a lot of civilizations, and if you look at the hieratic, some of the things that stand out is it looks very similar to Arabic, as well as the Demotic, which not preceded it but succeeded it later on in about like I believe the first century BC. And then from there, with the Demotic evolved into Coptic. So what happened was, in relation to the hieratic, there was a civilization called the Phoenicians. The Egyptians the hieratic had heavy influence on the Phoenician written script. What was done was they took the concept of those hieratic symbols and simplified them down even further to create a progenitor alphabet. And through that progenitor alphabet, along with some slight modifications, you get the Greek. So there's a clear through line in which essentially you find that the narrative of the time is essentially backwards. It is not they who civilized us, it is us who civilized them. And that decision, or that knowledge rather, that influenced why they used the symbology that they did for the Sphinx, adopting the pyramids, even the iconography of the Pharaoh. These are symbols of pride and grandeur, because no longer is this place that we were told the only thing great out of Africa was Egypt and it was white. Nah, those was black folks. And at that particular point in time, they referred to everything uh, this might get a little complex, and I might not be quite explaining it right, but they referred to a lot of texts referred to black people as Ethiopians, not as in from Ethiopia, but just broadly speaking, the black, what you would kind of think sub-Saharan or the black-skinned people, the darker peoples of the continent as Ethiopians. Um, and it was also spelt with an A. Uh, I'm not gonna say that. I might be. I don't want to say too much, but that has significance. That has a whole lot of significance. If you know, you know. Uh, but yeah, it was one of those things in which I do believe that that's the reason why we have the motives and symbology that we do. Um, because I mean, we are connected. It just in that one aspect, but there's other several others as well. Um, most chapters have their own ritual, I guess you could say. And when I'm saying ritual, don't take that as some dark, crazy shit. A ritual is just a common custom or practice. Like we often say, hey, you know, once you join, hey, you cross the burning sands. It that was a West African ritual from which one ascended into adulthood. And that euphemism, you know, every chapter is a little bit different. I know some chapters that literally do some things that involve some hot coals. But most chapters have something that they do to signify you have now joined. You have now ascended, for lack of a better term, um, to kind of signify that transition from a nascent stage of life into a more advanced adulthood, I guess if you will. Even my own chapter, like we didn't use fire; we used ice. You know, everybody says they crossed the burning sands, but I had to get frozen. Um, but it even certain chapters, they coincided their process, the length of the process rather. And granted, this is for everybody, and it gets a little muddled when you get down to this level. Uh, but certain chapters they made the length of their process, the length that it was, to coincide with the middle passage. So, and from my understanding of it, even speaking with some of the old heads, because there were some times where folks would be online for multiple years. They said that essentially, essentially that piece of it is a little hit and miss because there was some where a guy or a group may be online for multiple years, and it's like, yeah, they online technically, but we ain't really messing with them like that, and they just kind of on standby. And there's some where it's like, oh no, they going through the fire each and every night. They just ain't ready yet. We think they could be ready, but they could. So, but a lot of them would say like, hey, yeah, we would start the process up, and we would make sure that you know the process was you know to coincide with a particular time frame so that they're active, I guess you would say, when they're going heavy online, coincided with but yeah, they did it to coincide with the average length of the journey for the middle passage, which um, could take up to 6 months. And a lot of folks would be depending on weather, but you were looking at anywhere from 4 to 6 months on average. Like I've seen some that some outliers that kind of could get there early if they kind of, I guess, caught certain favorable conditions. But the average, he was on that water for about 4 months. So yeah, so I mean, there, and I'm trying to say as much as I can without kind of spilling all the beans, but they are every organization I can say is different. Um, but there's a heavy and, and distinct pride in blackness. It is not a we want to be chocolate dipped white folks type of thing. It is a honestly, like I said before, it is a thing of pride. It is a organization and group that was collect as a collective was supposed to be an engine for the uplift of Black America. W. I'm sure everybody's heard of W.E.B. Du Bois's. Excuse me. Let me get some water. I'm sure everybody's heard of W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of the talented tenth, which was supposed to be a group that, uh, essentially, a black elites that were to collectively steer the masses of black people in a direction for the collective uplift. Um, what a lot less people know about is this concept of the guiding 100, which to kind of simplify that, and it's a little bit more than this, but essentially, after a few years, he came to realize, like, you know what, white people may allow a group of black elites, but they would not allow a group of black elites to actually exercise their influence for the betterment of the collective of black folks. And because they are so much more of them than us, it would make those people easy targets. Therefore, what we have to do is today we say be on code. If we all move in a manner, in a way in which we are on code, then you aren't targeting, say for instance, a few at that time, maybe hey, a few thousand black folks. You're targeting millions of black folks, and you know that's a whole lot more difficult of a task, and that gives that mass more influence, more power, because it's kind of it kind of at that point it goes from being a single head of the dragon to a hydra. um, and I know I know some people have their feelings towards Greek organizations. Some feel that they, could be better in certain regards, and I'll say this too. Like, yeah, they aren't perfect. Uh, I love my A5A, and I do see areas where we could be better. And a lot of the criticisms and critiques that certain folks have from the outside looking in, know that it's not exclusively outside looking in. Um, One of the things that's very apparent throughout the history of these organizations is there's always been a power struggle within them in regards for who are we truly? Who should we be? What should we be? What should our aims be? Um, Even in terms of the history of AFI, um, there have been times where it was more of a, we had these aims which we said was for the uplift of black folks, but we were kind of operating more so like the social club and so on and so forth. And, you know, it's bounced around from being more active and being more social. And I feel it's probably similar for a lot of other organizations like KA Psi, Omega Psi Phi, so on and so forth. I feel like that's just from speaking with other members of those groups. I feel like that's something that's always present, and even from the national level all the way down to the chapters themselves. But I hope that kind of makes some things make sense, contextualizes some things. Um, you know, it. Thank y'all for riding with me and indulging my musings and ramblings and whatnot. If you have any other questions, leave them down below, and I'll do my best to try to answer them. Or if they're if I feel like they're a little long, I might be a little much to type. I might make a follow up. But peace. Hope y'all have a happy holiday and be blessed.